So Dr. Menke is a lecturer in biology here at Baylor. She got her Bachelor of Science in Biology at Texas Lutheran University. She came to Baylor after that and got her Master's in Biomedical Studies, and then also got her PhD in Biomedical Studies here at Baylor. Currently, she's teaching Bio 1306 or Bio 2. She's teaching genetics and the genetics laboratory class. And some fun facts about Dr. Menke. Her background is in molecular genetics, and her recent research involved the recombinant expression of pollen allergens in plant and yeast systems, and finding better ways to produce and extract recombinant allergens to use as immunotherapy and diagnostic reagents. In her spare time, she loves music, singing, guitar, piano, reading, hunting, and fishing, so very well-rounded. Without further ado, Dr. Menke.
Thank you, Peter. Welcome. Yes, I do enjoy hunting and fishing, and so why was this weekend so exciting? Specifically, yesterday was the opening day of dove season, so that's exciting. All right. Well, welcome. I'm glad you're here. I enjoy doing this because I do like to interact with students, but they also have wonderful cake at this event, and I love that cake back there, and so I was so excited when I walked in and saw they had it again. So I'll come back every year. Y'all have that cake back there, so it's a good one. Well, welcome. I want this to be an informal, hold on just a second. Should I clip this on?
Yes.
Give me a second. Okay, this way I can be recorded. Well, I want this to be an informal discussion. I don't have a PowerPoint. What are you going to do without PowerPoint, right? But, you know, I have PowerPoint all the time, so I thought, let's just keep this informal. I've got just kind of some little a bulleted list of things I want to share with you guys, but I want this to be interactive, so if there is something that you didn't quite understand, just raise your hand, yell out, and we can stop. We'll definitely have a time for questions afterwards, but we don't have to wait till afterwards to do questions. So if you want to stop me, please feel free, and we can get your questions answered and move on. But I also kind of want to get an idea of the classification of students in here, because maybe I can kind of tailor some things to that. So I'm going to start with, how many seniors in here? Juniors? Sophomores? Freshmen? All right, so that's kind of what I figured it would be, right? So more freshman, sophomore. And the main reason, as we will talk more about, is if you are a senior and you're just now coming to this, it could potentially be a little bit late to start some research, right? So I'm glad that you guys are here and are ready to get an early jump on research and get going. So a little bit more background on how I got here teaching at Baylor University. So whenever I graduated high school, I went to a real small, rural high school, and so I knew I enjoyed science, I knew I enjoyed biology, but they're just way back in the day in a small rural high school, there really wasn't anyone to help me out to see, you know, what could I do with that passion and that interest. And so when I went on to college, I decided, well, I enjoy biology, so I will be a biology major. That's a good place to start, right? And I always felt, you know, pressure because I was from a small rural high school. Oh, well, you should go to med school. You should be a doctor. If you like science, that's what you do with it. And so while I was passionate about medicine and the application of medicine, I just didn't ever really feel the calling to be a physician, a practicing physician. And, you know, I don't really like dealing with sick people, so I kind of thought that'd probably be a bad career move for me if I decided to go into medicine as a clinician there. So anyway, so it was a little frustrating because I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do with my major, but the great thing was when I went to college, I began to see all the opportunities that you have and what you can do with it, and I was so relieved to see that I didn't have to go to medical school because I wasn't called to that. And so I looked at many different career options, and that's what I encourage you guys to do. If you don't quite, some of you know exactly what you want to do, and that is great, but if you don't know exactly what you want to do, just start looking around, start talking to your professors, start asking people, talk about your interests. There might be some careers out there that, say you really have an interest in some sort of health-related discipline, there might be something out there for you that you didn't even know about. So just side note there on that. So whenever I was trying to decide what I wanted to do with this biology degree, I knew that I had fun in lab, I enjoyed labs. I signed on to be a teaching assistant, so as an undergrad I was helping out with teaching labs and so forth, and I really enjoyed the teaching aspect of that. I also did some tutoring, and I really enjoyed the teaching aspect of that as well. And then I got involved in some research projects, both at Texas Lutheran University, where I went to school, but also I did some summer research at UT Health Science Center in San Antonio. With the breast cancer gene, and I really enjoyed being in the lab. I really enjoyed research. I really enjoyed scientific inquiry as well as teaching, and so it just made sense to go into academia because those were that was a career that I could do both of those things. And so I went on to graduate school, got my master's and PhD. But something that I do recall, and something that I want to stress to you guys throughout this, is when you are juggling, and I've been there, when you're juggling your classes as well as research as well as extracurricular activities, because you got to have a little fun, right? And you have to make yourself a well-rounded individual. It's hard. It is very time-consuming, and research takes up a lot of time, and it's not always that gratifying. Isn't that horrible? I'm sitting here telling you why it's so bad you shouldn't go into it. That's not my point here, but I just want to make you aware that you can spend hours and hours and hours working on something, and at the end of the day, end of the week, end of the month, you may not have gotten anywhere. You may not be any further than you were on day one. And so sometimes that can be somewhat frustrating. So just we'll talk more about that as we move on. So anyway, that's why I decided to pursue grad school, and that's why I'm here teaching. And I love my job, and I always tell people, if you ever hear me complain one bit about my job, just slap me across the face, because I really do have the best job. It is a great job. It's a great job. So I want to start off by talking about what you really came. You didn't really care to hear my history here, but how do you get involved in research? Number one, how do you find a mentor? How do you find a professor to work with to start this journey? And the answer to that is, it's difficult. It just is. There's not this nice, neat formula that you can use. It does involve a lot of legwork in trying to track someone down who's willing to work with you. Something that I do want to mention that is a bit of a misconception, and particularly I'm addressing research within the sciences. Sometimes students come in and they say, man, I'm really excited that I get to go to Baylor and there are research opportunities for undergrads, and this is very exciting, and I'm going to come up with an idea, and I'm going to go to a professor and we're going to talk about this idea, and then I'm going to go to a lab and I'm going to carry out my idea. And that very, very, very rarely happens within the sciences. And the reason is not because you have a bad idea, right? You may have a really good idea, but the reason is within the sciences, and particularly I'm talking from more the cellular, genetics, molecular aspect, research is expensive. And so your project that you might have in mind may be a 10-year project, and it may cost $2 million to do. So unless you want to pay, there's got to be a money tree if you're going to spend 10 years at Baylor to do that project, right? And then you've got the millions of dollars to do it, which I'm assuming the majority of us in here do not have that. So what will you be doing? Well, when you find a mentor, you're going to be working on a project. Most of the time, there are going to be some exceptions to this. Most of the time, you're going to be working on a project that is specific to their lab. You're going to talk with that PI and see what is it that they do, and if that is something that interests you, then you are going to be joining them on their project, and oftentimes they will give you a very small little subset of their project that you're going to be working on, whether it's for an honors thesis or it's to gain research experience. So keep that in mind, that you're not going to go to a professor and say, I have this particular project in mind and I want you to help me with it. Again, there are some exceptions to this. There are some areas within science, areas within biology in which that might work. And if you can find a mentor to work with you on it, then that's great. But I think a lot of times students are a little shocked in how it works 90% of the time. So when you're trying to find your mentor, you need to find someone who is doing science that you enjoy. Something that you would like to be a part of, a project you would like to be a part of. Because how is your research going to get funded? Well, the PI already has grants that's funding their research, and that grant money is tied to their project. They just can't give you money from their lab to do a project that's not tied to their grant. So does that kind of make sense? Any questions kind of about how that works? You good there? And some of y'all may be like, oh, well, duh, I already knew that. Yes, sir.
Well, how do you figure out what the professors here are doing when there's 400?
Excellent question. So the question is, well, how do you figure out what the professor is doing, right? There's all these professors here. How do you figure out what they're doing? Well, I would encourage you, to start within the discipline. So if you are passionate about physics, then you will want to start seeing what the physics professors do. Most departments, and I can speak for specifically to biology, but most departments have websites with some sort of faculty focus or faculty tab where you can go in and look at, you can click on the name, and depending on the department, they may have a very detailed description of what they do on there, or it might be relatively small, just a short little summary paragraph. But if you look at that and you say, oh, that stuff terrifies me, I really don't want to do that research, then you know to move on to the next person on the list. So I would highly encourage you to go that route. Oftentimes, however, you are in a class with a professor and you enjoy that professor, you think you could work well with that professor, and that professor has shared with you within the class the type of research they do. And so you might get some ideas that way as to what they do. So does that answer your question there? Excellent. So, and I'm kind of jumping around here, so I apologize if I'm having, okay, yeah, I did that. Just talking off the cuff here. All right, so it is, particularly in a very large department like biology, it is sometimes difficult to find a mentor. So how do you do that? How do you approach them? What do you do? Well, when you find someone whose research you think you'd be interested in, maybe through a website or through discussions in class, when you find that professor, don't send them an email. Okay, because we get billions of those a day, and it's very easy for that to get put at the end of the pile. Go to them in person and have the conversation with them. And when you go to them and talk to them, don't just say, I'm interested in doing research with you. Do you have a spot in your lab? Because unfortunately, that professor has probably had that conversation 3 times already that same day, because there's so many of you and there's so few of us. So you need to have a way to stand out. More about that in just a minute, but start early because many of the labs are full. So you guys are freshmen and sophomore, you need to get on it now. And if the professor says, I'm sorry, I just don't have any more openings in my lab, I don't have any spots in my lab, ask them, say, well, I'm really interested in this. Do you have a wait list? Do you mind if I email you next semester and see, if there's an opening, or if you know of an opening that's coming up, maybe someone that's graduating or something like that, because some of them might be willing to work with you in that sense. Also, when you are looking for a mentor, this is also kind of it's something that I didn't realize students were not aware of. Are you guys aware of how the faculty designations work at Baylor? So Peter introduced me as a lecturer in the department. And so the way Baylor works, and the thing that's confusing is not every university calls the professors the same things, and so that gets very confusing. So at Baylor, there's sort of 2 different tracks that a faculty member can be a part of. One of them, such as myself, is the lecturer, senior lecturer route. And so my workload is heavier teaching with very little research. In fact, you don't even, as a lecturer at Baylor, your workload is all teaching, although most of us still do a little research because you just can't get us out of the lab because we get excited about it, right? And we like to work with students in the lab. So that route is lecturer to senior lecturer. So after 6 years, you apply to move up to senior lecturer status. And so right now, I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Biology. So I teach lots of students. I see some familiar faces in here as well. However, there's also faculty that are the tenure track tenure path. And so those individuals have a much lower teaching load and a huge research load, research component. And so within the sciences, the people who have the larger labs are going to be the tenure track tenure people. Now, as lecturers, a lot of us have some small labs, some undergraduate projects that we're working on, but we don't have graduate students and large labs because there's not a formal workload associated with that. So sometimes if you approach a professor, they may, if they are a lecturer or senior lecturer, they may say, oh, I don't have any ongoing projects right now. And that's just because our workload is 100% teaching. And so the research side of it is extra. It's kind of our fun, extracurricular type of thing. So just keep that in mind when you're going to ask people. Don't get discouraged if someone says, oh, I don't have a research project going on right now. It may be because they're lecturer, senior lecturer as opposed to tenure track tenure. So does that maybe clear up some of that, answer any questions that you might have about that? All right. So anyway, great that you had asked the question, because the next bullet on my list is look at departmental websites to see what the faculty focus is, what they're interested in doing, right? Because if you're going to be investing a lot of time and energy into this project, you need to love your project. You need to love your project a lot, right? Or otherwise, it's going to be very hard to be successful because you're not going to want to be there in the lab working on it, and it takes a lot of time. And so, as I already alluded to, go and ask the professor in person. Don't send an email. Now, keep in mind, here's another thing that I want to point out to you. Unfortunately, as an undergraduate student who is very intelligent and very smart and very passionate about research, you might think that you are going to go and you are going to go and work in this lab and you are going to solve all the problems in this lab and you are going to help this professor out, and they're not going to be able to live without you, right? That might happen sometimes, but most of the time, and this is not, I'm not being negative about this, but most of the time you are a cost to the professor. So in particular, if you are going to work in a lab of a professor who is a tenure track professor, that professor has certain requirements that he or she has to do to gain tenure. And a lot of those requirements involve grant writing, getting grants to fund their projects, and a lot of publications. And an undergrad coming into the lab is going to have to be trained in that lab, and so that is a time cost to that professor. And let's face it, you're not going to be really quick at everything, right? Because you're just learning, right? I mean, you got to start somewhere. You got to learn somewhere, right? And we understand that when you come into our lab. We understand that. But there's a reason why a professor might be leery of taking an undergrad into their lab, or maybe taking more than one or two into their lab, and it's because it is a very huge time investment for the professor, of which they don't earn any of that back, right? I mean, there's not a stipulation in our contract that says you must employ 3 undergrad researchers in the lab. It doesn't work that way. And so they're doing it because they enjoy the process of teaching within the lab, teaching undergrads within the lab. And also, let's face it, undergrads sometimes mess up in the lab, right? You might make a mistake. That's okay, it happens, right? You're learning. But at the end of the day, a lot of times undergrads are costs to the professor. So when you go in to ask them if you can work in their lab, you got to sell yourself. You got to make sure they know that you are serious about this. And that's why going in person is so important. You need to convince them that you are going to be a hard worker and you're going to do everything you can to be successful in their lab, and hopefully to help them out on some things as well. So how do you do that? How do you let them know that you are serious about this and not just one of the revolving door of students that come in and try to get on in our research labs? One of the best things that you can do is, if you know what their focus is and you're interested in it, go out and learn a lot about that. Go find their recent publications. We love to sit around and talk about our research, right? So go, before you ever approach them, go look for publications that they've had in the last couple of years. Read them. It's probably going to be pretty thick and difficult to understand, but read through it, get a general idea of what's going on. And so when you go to that professor, you can say, yes, I'm interested in your research. I see that you do X, Y, and Z. In fact, I've read your publication from 2013, and then if you really want to suck up to me and say, and my questions about your paper are, and you can have a discussion about that. And you don't have to be an expert on their research, but to show that you are serious, you have gone out and you have looked at this particular topic, and you're not just trying to get into any lab, right? But to say, I am interested in this, and I have taken the time to go out and read your publications, because that shows that you're serious and that you're going to be willing to do that within their lab as well. So that's just a little hint that I think could be very helpful. Something else to think about is, as I alluded to, research can be very expensive. Some research is not. I actually have a little project that I'm doing with an undergrad right now that is not a real expensive research project. It's with Drosophila, which is a very cheap system, and we're not doing anything earth-shattering. We're not curing cancer, but we have some interesting questions, some just basic scientific inquiry, and so we're going to carry that out. However, other types of research can be very expensive, and while the PI will likely have funding for that through grants that he or she has written, there is another option. Are you guys familiar with URSA grants? URSA, U-R-S-A, I don't even know what it stands for. Undergraduate Research and Scholarly Achievement. Thank you, Peter. And those I encourage you to apply for, and if it's something you're interested in, make sure you tell the PI that. Say, hey, I am familiar, not only am I familiar with your research, but I'm also familiar with the URSA grant writing process, and it is a process for undergraduate researchers, hence the name, to get some funds to help cover their research. And so you sit there and say to a professor, number one, I like your research. Number two, I know about your research. I've gone out and read your papers. And number three, I'm going to work hard to try to get some money so I won't be a huge cost to you. All of a sudden, they're starting to say, maybe I want to pay attention to this student. This isn't the same old student that comes in every day and just says, hey, can I join a lab, to get some experience. Just some things to think about there. The number one thing that you do not want to say, and I know this sounds like common sense, but you would be surprised how many students a semester I get in my office asking me this, telling me this. Do you have any positions in your lab? Because I know research would really look good on my resume. Don't say that, okay? Don't say that. While it may be true that being in a research lab will look good on your resume, that's not what we want to hear, right? We want someone who wants to do it because they're interested in it and they're passionate in it, not just because they want to build their resume and pad it a little bit. So just a little heads up there. So those are some options there for finding mentors within the Baylor community, but it is difficult, as I said, to find someone. Lots of students, less faculty. But there are some other options that I want to make sure you guys are aware of, and that is through these summer undergraduate research programs that are not at Baylor. There are internships and research programs all over the country at other institutions and other universities where you can go and you can spend the 3 months of summer, I think it's 12-week programs typically, working full days in a lab. You have to apply for these. Oftentimes they are called SURPs or SURFs, and it's SURP for Summer Undergraduate Research Program, or SURF, Summer Undergraduate Research Fellowship. Sometimes they're called REUs as well. And so these are wonderful opportunities because you get a lot, it makes a big impact. You get a lot of research because you're getting to spend full days and then some nights and weekends a lot of times too in a lab. So you're getting lots of experience there. maybe even the chance of a publication, because you're in the lab so much that if you're lucky enough, you might fall into a good situation at the end of a project where you might get put on a paper, so that's always good. But also, these are paid. Now, you're not going to get rich off it, right? But you can live off of it. And those are wonderful opportunities because you get it done in a summer and you apply for these, and you're not scrambling around trying to find someone here at Baylor whose lab you can work in, and you're not having to juggle it with your course load as well. So I highly recommend those. Sorry, there's a fly swarming me. All right. So I highly recommend those. There are some that are more local. There's some all across the state of Texas. I have students who go to, in fact, I was just talking to a student today. She went to Mayo Clinic. She applied and got that particular position, and she just came in to tell me how fabulous it was and how exciting it was, et cetera, et cetera. So highly, highly recommend those. And it makes you look, it helps to kind of diversify your resume, right? So not only, you're active, involved in things here at Baylor, but you've also gone somewhere else and had this wonderful research opportunity too. So a lot of times the deadlines for those come up. Usually the earliest is the December before that summer, but a lot of them are more January, February-ish. It just kind of depends on how competitive the program is that you're applying to, but apply to a lot of them. And some of them are specific as far as you have to be a junior or you have to have this many hours, but not all of them are that way. And how do you find those? It's just good old legwork on the computer. I'll tell you something else a lot of students do. If you are from the Houston area, you might try to find one of these programs there so you can live at home. You're not having to pay cost of living on top of it. So you might be interested in finding someone at MD Anderson. So you could go on their website and in their website search for summer undergraduate research. So I know a lot of students that do that. It can be very helpful. Additionally, another approach you could take, are there any students here that are in the Bio 1405 or maybe have taken 1406 or going to take 1406? Some of you are like, I have no idea what she's talking about. Great. Those are, in the biology department, those are what we call inquiry-based courses. So it's not the traditional freshman biology courses, it's inquiry-based. And so you're going to be doing active research as a part of that course for course credit. And while the project that you're doing there may not turn into an honors thesis or something, it might actually be a jumping ground. You might develop some questions based on that maybe you and the professor want to move forward with and talk about. So that's another option as well. Questions so far? Yes, ma'am?
How many students do you usually take
per lab?
Yeah.
So her question is, how many students do they typically take per lab? It depends on the size of the lab. There are some people that maybe they're getting close to tenure and they have lots of grad students and they say, until I get there, I'm not going to take any undergrads. And then there are some that may have 10 undergrads in their lab. It depends on the size of their lab, what projects they have. They may be working with some techniques that just the training alone on that technique may take 6 months. And so just as a cost to them, they may only be able to have one undergrad in the lab. So it will vary quite a bit. Yes, sir?
How do you get into an inquiry-based class?
The question is, how do you get into an inquiry-based class? I am only familiar with the ones that we have within biology, but I'm sure they probably exist in other disciplines as well. Anyone in here on 1405 this semester? Okay, so for our 1405, when you applied to Baylor and indicated that you were a biology major or had an interest in science, you got sent home an application and you applied for that inquiry-based thing, and so it's a selection process. But if you were interested, there is a 1406. We have two 1406 classes. One is the follow-up to that 1405. The other is not related to the other ones. So you would take, for instance, if you're enrolled in 1305, 1105 right now, you might want to take an inquiry base for Bio 2. You would need to go and talk to the professor. I think he has 60 seats in that class. It's Dr. Marty Harville who does the 1406 class. Other questions before we move on? Yes, yes.
Are there ever any SERPs here at the university?
Good question. So are there any SERF or SERPs here at the university? Again, I can only speak specific to the biology department. I think chemistry does as well. It all depends on if we get the funding. The past, I want to say 5 summers, we have had funding to offer that program within the biology department. And so the way it works there is you already have to have a mentor picked out, and I've already discussed that with them, and then you'll apply for that particular position. But yes, we do have them in biology, and so I would be relatively certain they would be in other disciplines as well. You're welcome. Was there someone back there had a question? No? Okay, so I want to finish up by, and I've alluded to a lot of this, but by giving you kind of a realistic picture of research in the lab. So first let's start with the positives, the pluses, right? It is amazing when you complete a project. It's amazing when something works, especially if you spent months trying to get it done and all of a sudden it finally works. That's very exciting. Within the research field, a lot of times you get to set your own hours. It's a lot of them, but you know, if something comes up and you need to work on something else for a little bit, then maybe you just come in and stay later in lab that day. That's how it works a lot of times. So it is a relatively informal setting that you work in. You get to work independently, so that's exciting. You get to kind of design your experiment, decide what you want to do. And again, I'm talking about kind of in the research in general right now. As an undergrad research, these obviously would not necessarily apply. And so it's most of the time a relaxed environment unless there's some sort of grant deadline coming up or something like this. So now some of the cons. It is a huge time investment. A lot of students, I hear this all the time. They'll say, well, I didn't get into med school, so I'm just going to go do research. And it's not any less time consuming than the whole process of getting into medical school and the studying you would do in medical school. So I think that's a little bit of a misconception there. It is a huge time investment. Be prepared. It's not this nice 8 to 5 day. Be prepared to work nights. Be prepared to work evenings. At the end of their research experience, a lot of my students say, wow, I had a good time, but I just never realized how drawn out and long the whole process is, right? And that's another reason why it's good to have these experiences so you can fully appreciate what it's like. You know, you may spend an entire semester troubleshooting a specific piece of your project, you know, whereas your goal was to complete that project in a semester. There's a lot of things that are not within your control. There's lots of repetition there. And the expense, depending on what discipline you're doing research in, it can get expensive. So something else to keep in mind there. Last thing I want to say is, can you be successful within research? What are some of the characteristics you need to be successful in research? You have to be willing to work independently. Now, as an undergrad researcher, a lot of that's not going to apply. I mean, you need the help, you need the guidance when you're getting started on this, right? But as a grad student, and from that point on, you have to be able to work independently. You have to be willing to troubleshoot on your own. There's not going to always be someone that you can go to and say, I need help with this. You've got to be able to do that on your own, and that's kind of the fun part of it, actually. Something else to think about when you're, you have to be willing to do the legwork up front. It's not all just lab work. You've got to be able to do the literature review. You've got to become very familiar with your topic. And so it's a lot of reading, a lot of time searching through articles in order to find answers that you have, or to come up with questions that you have by consulting the literature. So anyway, you have to be willing to do those things, and it can be a lot of fun. So I'm not trying to rain on your parade by any means, but I just want students to know it's not just, oh, I'm just going to go into lab a couple of hours a week and wash some dishes, right? I mean, that would be boring anyway. Why would you want to do that, right? But it's hard work. It's hard work. And if you want to be successful, you got to work hard. So that's all I have in my notes, but I would be happy to answer questions now that I didn't answer on the way throughout. Yes, sir.
So let's say you get a mentor and you spend a semester or a year with them, and then you realize that you kind of didn't like that project. how would you go about leaving the professor or maybe picking a new mentor?
So the question is, what happens if you've spent a year with someone in someone's lab and you just realize you don't like it anymore, right? You don't like that particular project, but maybe you want to seek out something else. It's not a problem at all. You're not going to hurt that individual's feelings as long as you're honest with them. Now, what you don't want to happen is because you don't like it, you just quit working so hard and you mess stuff up because you're not excited anymore. You know, they would rather you come to them and say, hey, I am so appreciative of the time that I've spent here in this lab, but I'm going to go, I also want to see what it's like in chemistry or in physics, and I'm going to seek out another research opportunity as well. But at the same time, you know, it is a balance, because if you're in a lab and they've invested in you and spent a lot of time training you, I don't want to say it's necessarily that you owe them, right? But keep that in mind, that if they have spent a lot of time working with you, you might want to try to finish up a few things before you just up and leave them. Yes, sir.
We talked mostly about laboratory research. Are there opportunities for clinical research as well?
Sure. So his question is, what about clinical research? And everything that I've said is going to apply to clinical research as well. The problem is, on our specific campus, we don't have that. But yes, there are these opportunities. There are these summer undergraduate research projects that are clinically based. I believe through Scott and White, there's internships. There's a connection there that I'm sure y'all are going to hear about that as well. Through Baylor, Scott and White, that are clinical-based programs as well. But everything that I've said is also going to apply to that as well. So excellent question. Mm-hmm. Other questions? Yes, sir.
What would happen if, for some reason or other, you can't get doing research for 1 year? What would you do to kind of make up for that?
If you could not get around to doing research for one of the years while you were at Baylor, is that what you're saying? Like you just hadn't got started yet? I guess it depends on what your overall goal is. For instance, if you are within the honors program and you're going to have to write a thesis, then not starting till later is going to be very difficult. And so you're definitely going to have to talk to the mentor about finding a project that can be completed in the time frame that you have. And unfortunately for that, a lot of times we don't know. You know, we can kind of guess the time frame, but things arise and things don't work. However, if you are wanting to get into a research lab just because you are interested in pursuing graduate school, which now, if you want to be a competitive applicant for graduate school within the sciences, you've got to have that lab experience. Then get in there as soon as you can. Just get in there as soon as you can. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
What if you join a research program and then you don't finish or they don't come up with anything by the time you apply to med school? Is that still like good? Looks good on your
Yeah, so her question is, what happens, you've done everything right, you've joined a research group, and you've been in it, maybe you've been in there for 2 whole years, and at the end of it, you didn't fully complete a project, you didn't get a publication out of it. That is extremely common. That is very common. And no, that does not, while it would be wonderful if you had a couple of publications on your name, it's not very often that undergrads get that. I would say what you're describing is what happens the majority of the time. And no, there is nothing wrong with that at all. What you do want to be able to do is be able to talk about your experience in the research and what you did and explain your project. And so if at an interview or something like this, whether it's med school, grad school, etc., they're going to see on your resume that you have worked in a lab and this is your project, blah, 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 or maybe you've written about it in a personal statement, but you need to be able to talk about that. They're not going to penalize you for not having publications, although having publications is definitely going to look really good. But no, don't worry about that one bit, because sometimes you're joining a lab on a small part of a project that in that particular lab, because of that type of research they're doing, the project is a 5-year project. So obviously they don't expect you to come out and complete that and get a publication, but rather they're doing it to get you that research experience. Nothing wrong with that at all. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Would having a resume ready for the professor be advisable? Or is it just
Good Good question. Okay, so would having a resume ready be advisable? It's tough because I really think it depends on the professor. Because some of them might go, wow, this student came in and they're prepared, et cetera, et cetera. And then others may go, oh, well, he or she's just assuming that, I've got a spot or something. So I think it's hit or miss. I would say don't worry about it. This is just my personal opinion, so there might be someone who disagrees with me and would love to see it, but I think I would rather just have a student come in and say, I know you're busy, could I visit with you for a little bit if now's a bad time, maybe we could set up an appointment, something like that, and sit down and just talk about their research and your knowledge of their project. And then you could also say, now if your resume has something on it that is very specific to what they're doing, or maybe some past research experience, rather than giving it to them, because I'll be honest with you, a lot of times students will give us that stuff and we just kind of throw it over here and we try to get through the day, right, and it may disappear. You're better off saying, and I also have some research experience. Last summer, I went to Mayo Clinic and I worked and blah, blah, blah. And I think that the techniques that I learned there are the same techniques that you use in your lab. Tell it to them like that. Don't put it on paper. It may not get read if it's on paper. Other questions? Yes, sir.
What would you recommend for someone who doesn't have any experience?
It's the typical, even in the work world, right? So someone's trying to get a job and you can't get a job because you don't have experience, but how do you get experience if no one will hire you? Same thing with research. Professors who are taking on undergrads, they don't expect you to have a research background because you're an undergrad. So I wouldn't worry about it. If you have it because you've done some things already, that's great, and they may find that helpful, but they're not taking you into the lab because they think you're going to be able to hit the ground running. They know that you're going to need some training. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Are there any tenure professors that are currently working on genetic research?
Good question. So are there any tenure track or tenured professors working on genetics research? It's a tough question because the field is so broad, and so a lot of professors may have a main focus in some sort of molecular biology, but an offshoot project that could be defined as kind of one of the subdisciplines of genetics and so forth. So we definitely have people who are doing genetics research, but there's so many different areas. For instance, we have someone he is a population geneticist, and so he looks at these cichlid fish and studies how those populations evolve, and there's definitely a genetic component to it, but it may not be the type of genetics that you're thinking about. So I think that there's just so many subdisciplines there, you're really going to have to kind of go and look at what they do in the papers they've published. Yes, ma'am.
If they don't have very many or much detail on their research on the various pages, do you suggest just talking to them, or how would you go about understanding their research without sounding?
Sure. So if they don't have a whole lot on their webpage, they should at least have a few sentences, and that should be enough to get you started. And there's a good chance that you're going to read those sentences and go, I have no clue what this is. It could be filled with a lot of, very technical things. Go out and just research it on your own. Try to figure it out on your own. Search for articles in which they're the PI on and so forth. That could be a really good thing. But yeah, it doesn't hurt going and talking to them. And I highly recommend that you always start with professors that you've had in class, right? Or if you're currently in their class, they're going to want to sit down and talk to you anyway. Maybe you just want to talk to them about the research. Or if you're in their class right now, go to their office hours and say, tell me a little bit about your research. Because, that way that it doesn't look like you're fishing for something. Does that make sense? Other questions? Yes, sir.
So for some of these SERPs and SERPs, what kind of institutions will have those? Usually the hospitals?
So the question is about the SERPs and the SERPs. What kind of institutions have that? Just about everyone. Most universities have it. So if there's a school in your hometown that you want to live at home, save some money, go to their school's website and search for it. Most of them have some sort of program like that. BS hospitals as well. I know MD Anderson does have a program. There's some, clinically based, laboratory based. You're going to find a little bit of everything. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, if there's no more questions and you can't leave yet, sorry. I know the cake's calling you, it's calling me too, all right? But it is important for us to do a survey and see how helpful this is. How can we help you guys out more? So Peter's gonna come here and talk to you more about that, but it has been lots and lots of fun. Get in touch with me if you have other questions, all right? Thank you very much.
So yeah, please just take a couple minutes, download a QR code reader, or if you don't have one, that's fine. Just fill out that survey for us. We want to know what you think. It's especially helpful for us as Burst because we want to make sure that we give you the speakers or the information that you're really looking for. And thank you, Dr. Mankey, for speaking about all these summer research programs. As you got the sheet at the very beginning, these are the summer research programs for the pre-health program here at Baylor. We have a bunch listed on here. I believe spots for 50 or 55 students. But we also have a lot of information on our website, our Burst website. It is literally baylor.edu/burst. That'll answer a lot of your questions. We have a list of like 150 schools and medical schools. There's also another database that we have linked. It's called like Summer Pathways to Research. And these are the types of things. Also, somebody asked at the very beginning about Baylor professors, you know, how do you read their research? I know it's kind of intimidating. So actually this semester we thought about that, and our journal clubs, which are going to be small groups, are going to be reading Baylor professors' papers. Unfortunately, I don't think Dr. Mankey's papers are on it, but we will definitely break down a lot of different professors' papers, and we're actually going to be taking you into their labs to kind of see some of the techniques that they do. So we have a biology, chemistry, you know, various departments like that, and it'll be on our application form as well. So if that's it, then thank you for coming. Our interest meeting will be this Thursday at 7 o'clock in B110. So thank you for coming.